Welcome to the political economy of the environment. Today's episode is about cultivated biodiversity. As an example of that biodiversity, I'm going to focus on this crop, what we call corn in the United States or maize in the rest of the world. It's the number one crop in North America, the number one crop in both the United States and in Mexico. In Mexico, corn's traditionally grown by small farmers, campesinos, peasant farmers, in a form of agriculture called milpa. Milpa involves planting corn together with other crops like chiles, like beans, like squash, together in the same field. And many diverse varieties of these crops are grown in those fields. Many diverse varieties of corn, for example. And that diversity helps to make milpa agriculture quite resilient. There can be an insect pest that attacks one crop or one variety of one crop, and yet the others will do okay. But the other extreme from milpa agriculture is the industrial corn production that we see in the Midwestern United States, where corn is grown in monocultures on huge fields. Mechanized equipment is used to till those fields. Pesticides are used to protect those monocultured fields from insect and pest populations. And in those fields, the phenomenon of genetic vulnerability becomes a big problem because you've got one crop and one variety of one crop grown in large areas. You have a phenomenon where the survival of the fittest means that you're going to see the evolution of pests and plant diseases, pathogens, that are particularly virulent on the most widely grown plants, the most widely grown crops and varieties of those crops. The process that Charles Darwin wrote about back in the 19th century when he talked about the phenomena that underlies evolution. And the problem of genetic vulnerability means that once those pests and pathogens arrive, you got a big problem because all your eggs are in the proverbial one basket. And your crop is not protected by that diversity that we saw in traditional milpa agriculture in Mexico, for example, because your entire crop can be hit by this new variety of disease or whatever. That vulnerability was displayed to the world for the first time, really. It got people's attention back in Ireland in the middle of the 19th century in the blight, the potato blight that produced what is sometimes called the Great Hunger. Potatoes were introduced from South America into Europe in the late 1500s. They were brought over by the Spanish. They spread throughout Europe. They became quite popular because it was a way to produce a lot of food on a small amount of land. And besides that, people generally like potatoes. In Ireland, the people's dependence on potatoes became particularly acute, not only because potatoes did well in the Irish environment, but because the British appropriated a lot of the best land for cattle and left the Irish peasants to survive off small plots where they grew potatoes. One potato variety, it was called lumpers, accounted for most of Ireland's potato production. And in the middle of the 19th century, a potato blight came along, evolved in the field, as one would expect it to evolve with such a widespread cultivation of a single variety, that knocked out 75% of Ireland's potato crop in the year 1846 and inflicted more crop losses in subsequent years. And that led to human suffering on an enormous scale. Out of a population of about 8 million people, it's estimated that 1 million of the Irish people perished in the famine that was caused by the failure of the country's potato crop. And another 1 million emigrated, many of them here to North America. A more contemporary example of genetic vulnerability was the southern corn leaf blight that struck the corn crop in the United States in 1970. About 1 billion bushels of corn were lost that year because of this blight that arose. That's more than 20% of the national harvest at the time. About half of that harvest was lost in some of the southern states where the blight originated, and then it rapidly spread. And 85% of the U.S. corn crop, it turned out, was varietally uniform in that it shared a single genetic trait, and that genetic trait turned out to be one that included vulnerability to this new leaf blight that had developed. Finally, a gene for resistance to that new variety of leaf blight was found in a variety of corn grown in Africa, and plant breeders incorporated it into the seed stock in the United States, and that's how we overcame the problem of the blight that caused the southern corn leaf blight disaster of 1970. A similar process of evolution affects the use of pesticides, causing something that is sometimes described as the pesticide treadmill. The survival of the fittest in the farmer's fields means that when you're blasting those fields with pesticides to kill the insects or kill the plant diseases or kill the weeds, it's only the few resistant ones that survive. You may kill 99.9% of the insects, but the 1/10 of 1% that survive are the ones that are a little more resistant to that pesticide. And they're the ones who pass on their genes. They reproduce, and the new generation that survives has greater resistance to that pesticide. And so what people have to do in response to the evolution of those more resistant pests is use more and more pesticides, heavier doses, more frequent doses, different pesticides, cocktails of pesticides, mixing them together. And at the end of the day, that same problem of survival of the fittest means that you start to develop superbugs that are resistant to more and more of these pesticides. Same thing happens with antibiotics in the field of medicine. And so to cope with that problem, what we do in industrial agriculture is we have plant breeders who engage in something that sometimes is called the varietal relay race. They're constantly scanning what sorts of new insect and pest threats are emerging in the farmers' fields. And when there are outbreaks that the crops being grown there are particularly vulnerable to, they rush to try to find varieties of that crop that have genes for resistance to this new threat, and then breed varieties, crossing the different varieties to come up with hybrids or combinations that have the genes for resistance to the new pest threat, as well as the other desirable properties in terms of suitability for the environment, high fertilizer response, etc., that characterize the varieties that became vulnerable. And as a result of that, the typical turnover time for a commercial variety of corn, let's say in the United States, is less than a decade. After 5-6 years, the variety becomes vulnerable to a new pest or insect or disease, and plant breeders have to come up with a new variety. And the raw material that they use for coming up with those new varieties is precisely the cultivated biodiversity that comes from so-called traditional agriculture. I say so-called because traditional agriculture isn't static, it's dynamic. The process of evolution is happening in the farmers' fields all the time. People are very open to and adapting new possibilities as they come along. But those traditional practices that maintain cultivated biodiversity are what sustain the raw material that's used by industrial agriculture to carry on the varietal relay race. So it becomes really important to maintain that crop genetic diversity. Now, one of the ways to maintain it is to conserve it in what are called gene banks. This is sometimes also called ex situ or off-site conservation. So the idea here is you go out and you collect samples of seeds of different varieties from around the world, and you store them in a gene bank. You store them in a central place, and that way, even if they were lost in the field, you'd still have that genetic heritage available to you, at least in principle. But there are three problems with gene banks as a reliable substitute for diversity in the field. The first is that gene banks aren't completely secure. Accidents happen, wars happen, and moreover, just because you put the seeds in the bank doesn't mean they're going to be there forever for you, because unlike, say, gold in Fort Knox, seeds in the bank are living organisms, and after a while, they die. And so if they're maintained under ideal temperature and humidity conditions, they may be viable for 30 or 40 years, but after a certain period of time, you need to regenerate the seeds. In other words, you need to take them out of the bank, plant them somewhere where they're not going to cross-pollinate with other varieties, and then take the seeds that result when those plants mature and dry them and put them back in the bank. And that takes money. And oftentimes, I'm afraid, the public institutions that provide this service of maintaining gene banks are not adequately funded. And so that is another reason why the seeds in the bank aren't entirely secure. A second problem with the gene banks is that even if the seeds were secure, you wouldn't necessarily know the properties of the varieties you have in the bank. You might know what the crop is, what it looked like. Maybe it was a red corn. You might know where the seed was collected, maybe in the Mexican state of Guerrero. You might know the year it was collected, maybe in 1982. But you don't necessarily know, in fact, you're unlikely to know, whether that variety of corn is capable of providing resistance to a new environmental threat. Droughts at a periodicity of 3 or 4 weeks, a new insect or pest variety which may not even have existed at the time that that seed was collected. The only way you can find out about the properties of these seeds is to grow them. And if they're growing in the farmers' fields around the world, it's the farmers themselves who have the information about the varieties, who know what these different varieties are capable of doing, what their response is to different environmental conditions. And so that knowledge actually is part of the cultivated biodiversity, and just putting the seeds in the bank doesn't capture the knowledge about the seeds. And of course you can grow the seeds out and try to figure this out, but that's an expensive way to try to gather that information. And a third reason why ex situ conservation is not an adequate substitute for conservation in the field is that it doesn't maintain the ongoing evolutionary process that's happening in the farmers' fields that we'll talk about more in just a moment. All you could do at best, if these things were secure and if you knew everything about the seeds you had in the bank, which you don't, would be you could freeze in place the existing stock of crop genetic diversity, but you couldn't maintain the evolutionary process in the farmers' fields under the full pressure of natural selection, newly evolving pests and pathogens, climate change, etc., that produce the diversity in the first place and keeps producing more diversity over time. Crop diversity in the field, what's called in situ crop genetic diversity, is not distributed equally across the world. Of course, it's concentrated in the places that still practice ecological agriculture as opposed to industrial agriculture, and it's concentrated in particular parts of the world for particular crops. And in general, the diversity is greatest in the place where the crops have been cultivated the longest, where there's been more time for diverse varieties to evolve through farmer-guided adaptations to diverse microhabitats and people's diverse tastes. And so the question becomes, well, where have the crops been cultivated the longest? And the answer is, of course, the places where they were first domesticated, however many thousands of years ago. So there's a correlation between the ancient centers of origin of crops and the modern centers of diversity of those same crops. The way that that diversity evolved was through the process that Charles Darwin described as artificial selection. Indeed, in the first chapter of his book, The Origin of Species, this is what he talked about. He talked about the evolution of pigeons and strawberries, for example. And he said the way that new varieties evolve is that people are choosing which plants or which animals to reproduce based on characteristics of those particular individuals that make them particularly desirable from the standpoint of the people who are doing the selection. So in the case of strawberries, for example, he writes, gardeners picked out individual plants with slightly larger, earlier, or better fruit and raised seedlings from them. And again picked out the best seedlings and bred from them. And over the generations of the strawberries, you got nicer and nicer, bigger, juicier, tastier strawberries, a process that Darwin could see going on in his own lifetime. And it was indeed part of what helped him come to the idea of natural selection, because he realized similar kinds of selection processes happen in nature. So where did that process of diversification have the longest time to develop and thereby develop the most varieties? It's where the crops originated. And where did that happen? Well, the man who first really investigated that was the great Russian botanist Nikolai Vavilov. Vavilov lived in the early part of the 20th century before he died in a prison camp in Stalinist Russia. And he sent teams of researchers around the world to the places where there was the most diversity to try to explore where these crops originated and look for archaeological evidence of the early origins of the world's crops. And his teams, when they did that, collected different seeds and brought them back to his institute in the former Soviet Union, which at one point had the greatest ex situ collection of crop genetic diversity in the world. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, those ex situ collections aren't perfectly secure, and a lot of the seeds in the bank died because they weren't adequately maintained in the Soviet Union. What Vavilov found was that there were really concentrated centers around the world that had produced most of the crop genetic diversity, and indeed produced the crops themselves originally, on which human food security depends today. So for example, maize or corn originated in southern and central Mexico and Central America. And different crops originated in different places, most of which happen to be located in the so-called global south, in relatively low-income countries, and the diversity there continues to be maintained in these places by small farmers who are using traditional techniques like milpa agriculture in Mexico. And so the stewards of cultivated diversity today are people like this kid and his family who grow corn on the hillsides of southern Mexico, sometimes in combination with other crops using that milpa technique. And the diversity that they maintain in the field is an enormously important resource for the future of humankind. Sometimes when environmentalists think about biodiversity, they think mainly about polar bears or spotted owls or whatever. And while I have nothing against polar bears and spotted owls, long may they flourish, and hope someday that I might even see one, I think we ought to pay some attention as well to this form of biodiversity on which our own long-term food security depends. And the people who maintain the diversity are the small farmers in the centers of crop genetic diversity, the Vavilov centers. In general, there's an inverse relationship between farm size and crop diversity. That is to say, the smaller the farm, the more the diversity, and the bigger the farm, the less the diversity. And that's because cultivating diverse varieties, doing things like milpa, is quite labor intensive. It's because the farmer's knowledge is a key part of adapting different crops and different varieties to variations in the landscape, to differences in microhabitats. And it's partly because it's small farmers that still survive in the so-called marginal agricultural environments, the places that aren't as suitable to large-scale mechanized agribusiness operations. And many of those marginal environments are the ones where crop genetic diversity is being maintained today. Unfortunately, what we're witnessing around the world is a process of genetic erosion, a loss of cultivated biodiversity, and that's propelled by two things. One is the spread of so-called modern or industrial agriculture into the global south. For example, in the so-called Green Revolution in rice and wheat, which led to the proliferation of highly fertilizer-responsive varieties in much of Asia, for example, there came with that the replacement of many diverse varieties of rice and wheat by a handful of varieties that had been bred in modern plant breeding institutions, largely public sector institutions. And so, although that increased crop yields, that's the great thing about the modern and industrial varieties, is you can grow a lot of food on a given acre of land, it led to the displacement of the diverse local varieties on which ultimately the sustainability of rice and wheat farming depend. The process of genetic erosion has also been pushed along by international trade, as cheap food products from industrial agriculture displace the more costly products of traditional agriculture. So, for example, when NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, led to the abolition of tariff barriers against U.S. corn in Mexico, what it did was open up Mexico to the influx of a lot of industrial corn produced in the United States, displacing some local production, including production by small-scale farmers that had been growing diverse varieties. So what we need to think about as a society, as a global society, as a world, is how to sustain the cultivated biodiversity on which our long-term food security depends, on which the varietal relay race rests, on which our ability to adapt industrial agriculture to changing environmental conditions ultimately rests. And to do that, there are several steps that one could think about taking. One very important one would be to remove the anti-small farmer biases that currently affect agricultural policy around the world. Large farmers tend to get a lot of government support and subsidies. Small farmers don't tend to get much at all. In fact, small farmers are sometimes treated as if they're ignorant and backward and really ought to get a real job working in a factory or growing fruits and vegetables for export to industrialized country markets or whatever, whereas instead, as I've suggested, they ought to be rewarded for their contributions to world food security through their stewardship of crop genetic diversity. One way to help reward them would be to help develop markets for their crops. Certification systems that certify that crops being grown are diverse traditional varieties as opposed to industrial crops could be an important step towards developing better markets for their crops and better prices for their crops. Providing local public goods would help to encourage small farmers to remain good stewards of crop genetic diversity. If people can get their kids educated, if they can have babies in healthcare facilities rather than home, reducing infant and maternal mortality, these are things that could help small farming communities around the world in the mega centers of crop genetic diversity. And we ought to be providing those as one of the ways of rewarding them. There could also be payments for environmental services, money that's provided to help sustain people's livelihoods in places where crop genetic diversity is being maintained. And the world as a whole ought to be able to finance those payments. Wouldn't take much, and it would both give people an incentive to keep maintaining stewardship of this cultivated biodiversity and would improve their livelihoods. And we could have policies to encourage part-time farming, because as societies develop, as incomes rise, it may be that there is a real attraction of not being farming alone, but at the same time doing some farming on the side. And the choice between farming and not farming doesn't necessarily have to be a binary either-or choice. And finally, we ought to provide social recognition to the farmers around the world whose activities brought us the food crops we eat today, brought us the cultivated biodiversity on which our ability to continue eating those foods down the road ultimately depends. So the bottom line is that agricultural sustainability depends really on cultivated biodiversity, and that traditional agriculture helps to underpin the sustainability of so-called modern agriculture, of industrial agriculture. The long-run sustainability of low-diversity farming depends on a continuing flow of biological inputs from high-diversity ecological agriculture. And so it's incumbent on us to figure out ways to prevent the process of genetic erosion, which is threatening the sustainability not only of livelihoods of small farmers around the world, but of future generations of human food security as well. Thanks very much.